We are your home theater and AV questions answered. This is AVRant. Want your home theater or AV question answered by Tom and Rob? Send it to question@avrant.com. Welcome to AVRant. I'm Tom Andry, and I'm here with
Rob H.
Kris. Kris got his new Onkyo RZ1100, I don't know how to say this thing, RZ1100 AV receiver. After running ACU EQ, he still has the option to enable manual equalizer settings. He also gets the option to add DSP sound modes on top of the Dolby Surround Up mixer. Although so far, he's just preferred the vanilla Dolby Surround setting, which is probably for the best. He's curious about the manual EQ options, though, and wants to know how he should go about tuning them. With up to 9 bands of EQ for each speaker channel and 5 EQ bands for the subwoofers, is this almost like getting a mini DSP for free? Can other receiver brands, Denon and Marantz in particular, do the same sort of thing after running their version of auto setup? Many receivers do have manual EQ options on there.
Yes, but it typically does deactivate the auto EQ thing.
Yeah. So, is this like a mini DSP? It's really kind of not. Mini DSP is quite a bit more powerful, and you can just you can use it with Room EQ Wizard and just kind of load up your curve, and it'll do. This is going to require you to first figure out your curve, whatever that's going to be, and then put in these settings. And many times how granular the controls are is the big difference between something like this and something like the mini DSP. And the mini DSP is very granular. This is going to be a lot more clunky.
Yeah, it's much closer to like your old school graphic EQ from way back in the day. Yamaha actually gives you a parametric EQ, which is essentially the same type of filter that a mini DSP has.
Right.
So Yamaha is closer, but in Yamaha's case, they still don't let you have completely free range over what frequency the parametric EQ is centered on. So the mini DSP is still more powerful than what's built into the Yamaha. This is similar to what Denon and Marantz offer. Denon and Marantz also offer a manual graphic EQ, essentially. But in Denon and Marantz's case, that automatically turns off Odyssey if you put on the manual EQ, whereas this Onkyo, you can sort of tune on top of what ACU EQ did.
Right.
So if this is a matter of, you're saying how should you make use of this? Well, you could measure. You could get a measurement microphone, measure in Room EQ Wizard after having run ACU EQ. If what you're going for is a straight line and you notice there is a hump or a dip that happens to line up with one of these 9 bands that's already there, or one of the 5 bands in the subwoofer output, you could make an adjustment there. More likely, though, this is use it sparingly and perhaps to taste. Maybe you want voices accentuated a little bit more, or consonant sounds to be a little bit louder or softer if you're hearing some sibilance. So maybe you adjust the 4 kilohertz band a little bit, the 2 kilohertz band, something like that. But I would use this quite sparingly. And yeah, you could absolutely measure, but you're limited by these preset bands where these EQ filters fall in the Onkyo there.
So there's a feature to activate a THX Cinema filter. Is that essentially just another DSP listening mode? Should it be turned on or off? I did a little research into this, and based on the manual, if you look up Cinema, like in the manual, if you do a search for it, it shows up one time, and it's in relation to a THX Cinema mode or something. And basically, it is exactly like a Dolby Surround
a listening
up
mode.
Mixer. It takes and expands. It's supposed to expand the sound to make it sound more like you're in a real theater.
I think how he wound up with the phrase THX Cinema filter is because within the settings menu, there's all the little sub-menus, and there is a THX sub-menu, and directly below that is a filter menu. And I think maybe, especially if you're reading it in the manual, it looks like it's just THX filter.
Right.
Like that's how it shows up when you're reading it. They're two sort of separate things. So THX Cinema is a listening mode. It is similar to a DSP mode. It's something that takes 5.1 content and expands it to 7.1. So that's one thing that it's doing, and it also applies THX's own sort of tuning to the thing. Where it is beneficial in this Onkyo is that Onkyo doesn't provide something that is akin to a feature we like in Odyssey that's called dynamic EQ.
Right.
What dynamic EQ does is if you are listening at a volume level that is below reference volume, and because of our non-linear human hearing, some of the sounds you're supposed to hear might become inaudible or just unbalanced. They don't seem as loud as they ought to, not because they aren't technically as loud as they should be, but because our ears don't hear it that way once you're below reference volume. Well, Odyssey Dynamic EQ looks at how low you've turned the volume and sort of compensates for that. So it'll boost some of the bass to keep it audible, that type of thing. THX has a similar thing that they call Loudness Plus. So that's kind of the feature but it's only active when you're using a THX listening mode.
Right.
So you can only do THX Loudness Plus when you're using a THX listening mode. That's where that might be beneficial to you. If you listen all the time at -20 on the volume dial, you might want to use THX Loudness Plus. The filter thing that came right after that in the menu is essentially there for... it gives you 3 different bands to try and compensate for standing waves. So it's an additional separate EQ, but it's like system-wide. So they give you 3 additional bands where you can try and tame like a really big peak that might be in your bass frequency response. So it isn't technically part of THX; it's separate from that, but it did show up right beside it when you're reading the manual. So I think that's where that came from.
All right. So he's using BoS Optimus speakers as his front height and top middle speakers. They're mounted on the walls, not the middle speakers, or anyways, not on the ceiling, but they are way high up, basically right against the ceiling. He did some experimentation with the setup, and he found that if he angled the speakers upwards so that they were aimed at the ceiling rather than down at the seats, he then set them as Dolby enabled upward firing speakers in his Onkyo, that he actually found the sound to be noticeably more pinpoint precise. Have you ever considered something like this, and why would it sound so different versus just pointing them at the seats and setting them as normal front height and top middle speakers? BoS, dude, like for real.
Well, that's one part of it, is BoS.
Yeah, BoS is like the height of non-linearity. They have very much their own sound, and I mean they are. I don't know exactly which. I googled BoS Optimus speakers. I was like, it just comes up with. I don't remember which one he's talking about. So reflected sound has kind of always been their thing. It also makes it sound a little bit more diffuse, which in some cases can make it sound like you know exactly a little bit more where it's coming from as it's bouncing off the ceiling. Could be hitting you more directly than... I mean, a lot of times their tweeters are angled. I don't know if these ones are. They usually are. They're angled off to the side, but by pointing them up, you could be basically pointing them more towards yourself through the reflection. There's a lot of explanations here that could explain this. In the end, I'm glad you tried it, and you should stick with it and not worry about why it works all that much.
There's that. Now, this is actually kind of adding fuel to the fire of my suspicion that what that Dolby-enabled upward firing setting in this is in your AV receiver, not the speakers. But when you say I have Dolby-enabled speakers, we know for a fact that applies a Dolby EQ to the speaker output. And that EQ is based on their research into human head-related transfer functions, which are the things that let us identify the direction that a sound is coming from based on the outer shape of our ear and our skull and our tops of our shoulders and all that stuff. Our brain uses all of that extra information to tell us that a sound is coming from overhead. A while back, I had the suspicion that even when you use the upward firing drivers and set them up as they say, which is, on top of your regular speakers, but shooting upward, I was like, I don't really know that the sound is reflecting off the ceiling and that's what makes it work. I think it's this curve they're applying that tricks your brain into thinking the sound is coming from overhead. Could be a phase.
They could be doing some
well, it's specifically a head-related transfer function frequency curve. It's supposed to trick your brain into thinking sound is coming from overhead. So if you took a speaker and actually put it up high and then applied the frequency curve to trick your brain into thinking the sound is coming from up high, I'm like, well, maybe that would actually really work, right? Because it's basically it's almost like magnifying the effect of having something originating its sound from above you. It's almost like magnifying that effect. That's a suspicion on my part, but I kind of think maybe that's what's going on. It actually does kind of make me want to try setting my front height and rear height speakers as Dolby enabled to see if that enhances the effect. That's something
Sounds like
try.
You got some homework there, Rob.
Yeah.
So he says his room is a great room. It's wide open. He's been planning on adding a pair of in-ceiling subwoofers. He's been using a pair of Samsung subwoofers. I didn't know Samsung? Maybe?
Oh, sure. They have their home theater in a box systems and that, so it's
They aren't
probably
cutting it, but the in-ceiling subwoofer plan is obviously more complicated and costly, so it's not something you do right now. He could, however, afford a pair of SVS SB2000s. Not right away, but sooner than the in-ceiling subs. The SB2000s are about as physically large as he can go, though. So considering all that, should he just wait and go with his in-ceiling plan, or would the SB2000s be a better choice? What would we do? I'm going to be honest with you, dude. I have suggested before in-ceiling subwoofers or in-wall subs or in-floor subs before, and they are so often, to me, not worth the cost of them. They're quite a bit more expensive than their brethren that you just stick in the corner of your room.
Yeah, and
They
if it
don't
does
have
turn out
the-
to be suboptimal placement, you ain't gonna do much about it
Yeah,
without a
you're kind
whole
of
lot of
hosed.
cost and hassle.
Yeah, and not only, but I think, I mean, the extension usually isn't nearly as good. You don't get as much, sub for your money in that case, unless you're doing something like an infinite baffle sub. But once again, you're stuck at that point with whatever you put up there, and that can be a problem. He didn't really tell us how big this room is, but we gotta assume it's a bazillion.
Yeah,
cubic
great
feet.
room, wide open. We can assume it's well above what we would call a medium-sized room.
Right. So, and the SB2000s are not going to be big enough. I mean,
Yeah, well, not
that's
to pressurize it. I
not
mean,
to
it's not like you're
pressurize
not going to hear bass coming from them. You're going to hear bass notes, but it's not going to fully. You're not going to feel it.
I am unconvinced that any in-ceiling subs that he might add to this room are going to fully pressurize anyways.
Unless he is talking infinite baffle and he's going for some massive,
18
or 21-inch drivers or something.
up in the ceiling.
Yeah.
If you're not planning on fully pressurizing anyways, if that's not, and you don't listen that
Right.
loud, I think I'd be okay with saving the money and going with the SVSs.
Yeah, I mean, the nice
that
thing,
would be
again, the thing we love most about SVS is that really great DSP protection, so that turn them up as loud as they go, they'll play as loud as they can, and then just politely refuse to play any louder. They're not going to bottom themselves out. They're not going to damage themselves. So they're a great choice in that respect.
Right.
Can fully appreciate that, hey, look, you got aesthetics, you got walkways, a sub can only be so big and still be viable. Just if you go into it knowing, hey, I'm not going to feel my entire rib cage moving when the bass hits, all right? I'm not going to get that kind of pressurization. Right. As long as your eyes are open to that, that's I wouldn't say no. It's just you're not going to fully pressurize. That's all.
So I had a conversation with my son the other day about subwoofers. We talked about on the podcast.
Yeah.
And I said, you feel this the couch move. Well, that's what subwoofers do. So the other day, they went to the movies with a field trip for their camp or whatever, and they were in reclining seats. They were talking about. I said, were they D-box seats? He goes, I don't know. What's a D-box seat? I'm like, it's a seat that moves, as the movie goes. He goes, oh, we don't need those. We've got subwoofers.
Nice.
Like, you're my new favorite son. So one of the other ones was for parts if one of you guys breaks down. So I was extremely pleased. I'm like,
I never got to tell on the podcast my Wonder Woman D-box story because I was saying Alien Covenant, super disappointing watching that in D-box because the D-box seats barely moved. Wonder Woman had the single stupidest use of D-box I've ever had, which is there is horse riding in that movie, and they move the seats like you're on a horse. Ka-clop, ka-clop, ka-clop.
The drinks? You have drinks and popcorn? The things go flying all over the place? That's
I mean,
crazy.
It wasn't that violent, but it's not a funny part of the movie. I about
they're-
busted out laughing because I'm like, this is the dumbest movement that a seat can do. Try and make you feel like you're riding a horsey.
Not sure that's the dumbest movement, but it's probably it. All right. Want your question answered? Send it to question@avrant.com. This is AVRant.
Now go out and listen to something.